The NFL season is just days away, and I'm confident this video is going to help you dominate your fantasy drafts. Because today's a big day. We're revealing the top 30 wide receivers, rankings, and tiers to you beautiful people for the first time this year. So let's get into it. Here are the top 30 wide receivers for 2023. And it starts with an obvious name, Justin Jefferson. Look, he has to be the #1 receiver on here. Because Jefferson led every single receiver last year in basically everything. He played all 17 games, 184 targets, 128 receptions. All of these led every player. And now, Kirk Cousins' security blanket in the red zone, and Adam Thielen is gone and not on this team, and he leaves behind over 100 targets. Now, this is good news because maybe it leads to even more red zone usage than Jefferson had last year, which we can see that 8 touchdown season get back to being double digits, especially when he's seeing so much volume. And it's worth noting that last year, Kirk Cousins played injured. If you watch the Netflix documentary Quarterbacks, you could see that it was a serious injury for most of the year, which led to Jefferson seeing 22% of his targets being uncatchable. So for 2023, expect high volume and even more accurate passes. Now, the #2 wide receiver is the Bengals wide receiver, Jamar Chase. And heading into last year, there was a question of like, is T. Higgins quietly the #1 wide receiver on this team? But that question was put to rest last year. Look at this. In 2021, the first read, the first guy Joe Burrow was looking at, they were tied. So yeah, they were both the wide receiver 1. But then last year, 37% of the time, it was Jamar Chase on the first read from Burrow, only 21% of the time Higgins. And once Jamar Chase got healthy last year over the final 7 games, he averaged 24 points, 100 yards, and nearly 12 targets per game. And one more thing, according to Pro Football Focus, Jamar Chase led every single wide receiver in his usage last year, ahead of guys like Justin Jefferson and Devontae Adams. He had the best wide receiver usage. Now, our #3 wide receiver, as we continue to stay in tier 1 here, is a guy who I think has a lot of upside in Tyreek Hill to be the #1 wide receiver, because last year he was the most efficient wide receiver in football. And in 13 games with Tua healthy, Tyreek averaged 21.7 points, which would have ranked #1 among qualified receivers last year. And one more thing, here's another nice tweet from Football Insights. He says, targets over the middle field, they aren't common in football, but they're valuable for fantasy. And look at the amount of points on targets 10 plus yards downfield last year. Tyreek Hill was by far and away #1. So Tyreek's our #3 receiver. This next guy is our #4 receiver. And we'll stay in tier 1, and it's Cooper Kupp, our #4 receiver. He remained efficient last year despite getting older, 7th in wide receiver efficiency, and the fella averaged 22.4 points per game, meaning for the 2nd straight year, he led every single receiver in points per game over the 9 games he played last year before injury. Now, he's expected to play week 1, and so is his quarterback, Matthew Stafford, who battled 3 injuries last year. Now, the crazy part to all of this, many people are saying, oh, but the Rams are going to stink this year. And my answer to you is, well, who cares? Because the Rams were bad last year, 25th in overall offense, 29th in plays per game. They didn't even run a lot of plays, and Kupp was still the #1 receiver in points per game. Let's keep going. We have one more tier 1 receiver. And for this final guy, it's Stefon Diggs. These tier 1 receivers are guys that I think can finish #1 overall or have a better chance compared to all of the rest. Look, Stefon Diggs last year was #1 at beating both man and zone coverage. And just a year ago, he finished 6th in fantasy points per game. He's now been a top 10 receiver every single year with Josh Allen. But the big thing to point out, Diggs saw 31% fewer points in the final 9 games while Josh Allen was injured. And it wasn't a slight injury. He had a torn elbow. Diggs was the #1 receiver in fantasy before this injury. Now we head to tier 2, and it starts off with CeeDee Lamb, who, look, this younger wide receiver just has the rare ability to get volume and be efficient. Because last year, he was very quietly 4th amongst every single receiver with 156 targets. But despite seeing high volume, he was still efficient. 4th in wide receiver efficiency last year. Typically, when you get high volume, your efficiency drops, not for CeeDee Lamb. And now Lamb is entering his prime of his career at just 24 years old. Now, the #7 wide receiver in tier 2, it's Devontae Adams. Despite being 30 years old, this guy last year, he still had it. He was #2 in targets, #6 in wide receiver efficiency, and #1 in downfield usage. And now heading into this year, Darren Waller is gone, one of the best tight ends in the league, averaged nearly 6 targets per game last year. And even if you're not a fan of Jimmy Garoppolo being Adams' new quarterback, Adams is still going to see like 180 targets. Look at his competition. Jacoby Myers is there, basically going to replace like the 93 targets for Matt Collins. And then there's no Waller. And look at this. Nothing else is out there. Hunter Renfrow wasn't involved last year. Keelan Cole, DeAndre Carter. I mean, we're talking about special teams players. So Adams is still highly valuable, and so is our #8 receiver. And if you're finding this helpful, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you see all the content we're dropping this year. It'll help you out. And our #8 receiver is 3rd-year player for the Detroit Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Last year, he was a 6th-round pick in fantasy drafts, went on to be a league winner, averaging nearly 19 points when he was healthy. That's top 5 amongst receivers last year. Now, despite being so great last year, Amon-Ra now goes as like the wide receiver 10 in drafts, even though he has less competition. He won't have TJ Hawkinson for the entire season, and DeAndre Swift is now gone. And a reminder, Swift was a top 5 receiving back last year in terms of efficiency. Now, of course, these players were replaced. Sam Laporta, an exciting rookie, replaced Hawkinson. And then if you go up to the running back position, well, now you don't have no more DeAndre Swift, but you have an exciting player, a pass catcher in Jahmyr Gibbs. But these guys are rookies, not proven proven pieces like Hawkinson and Swift who have had success in the past are. And when you look at the wide receiver core, it's basically just Marvin Jones, like a 33-year-old wide receiver that's going to be a threat the first month and a half of the season for Amon-Ra. Now, our number 9 receiver is a monster. It is AJ Brown, who is a nightmare for opposing defenses, and last year he was finally in his career used downfield. Brown was 4th in air yards and 5th in downfield usage. But it wasn't just downfield, he was earning targets everywhere. He ranked number 1 at earning targets versus man coverage. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that he was beating single coverage, one-on-one man coverage. Whenever they didn't put a safety over top, Jalen Hurts was throwing it to AJ Brown, who had 910 receiving yards, as PFF points out here, the most of any receiver against single coverage last year. And it likely has to do with the fact that he has a top 10% speed score of all time and is 226 pounds. So yeah, he's going to beat a lot of cornerbacks one-on-one. Now, last season he had a career year, 146 targets, by far the most of his career, top 10 in the NFL. And this was while not even really playing in the fourth quarter because the Eagles were blowing out so many teams. Expect more targets because of that this year when the games are closer. That takes us to tier 3, and it starts off with our number 10 receiver, Garrett Wilson, who last year, man oh man, this guy was held back by his quarterback, Zach Wilson. Check this out. Last year, in 8 games without Zach Wilson playing, and that means Joe Flacco and Mike White, not great quarterbacks, were his quarterback. Well, he still put up 17.3 points per game on 11.4 targets per game. Zach Wilson was the problem. And now he has Aaron Rodgers, who Aaron Rodgers' number 1 receiver averages a top 8 fantasy finish. And that's not just Devontae Adams. No, Christian Watson was the wide receiver 7 when healthy last year. Jordy Nelson in the past, not just Adams. Now, our number 11 receiver in tier 3 is going to be Devonta Smith, AJ Brown's teammate. Look, Smith put on a lot of size last year, and it was pretty evident the Eagles actually used him the most, according to reception perception, as the number 1 receiver, not AJ Brown. And in that role, he actually had a similar success rate to Tyreek Hill, the most efficient receiver in the league last year. Now, check this out. Devonta Smith last year in week 1, his game logs, receptions 0, receiving yards 0, fantasy points 0, a bunch of goose eggs. But after this, from week 2 on, he was a top 10 receiver in fantasy. And he was the number 2 receiver over the final 7 weeks of the season. But now he goes in like the 3rd round of drafts. Next up in tier 3 is Jalen Waddle, who is a fantastic player. He's been a top 15 fantasy producer each of his first 2 years, and last year he led the NFL in yards per catch. But there's an issue. He's taken as a borderline top 10 receiver in fantasy, even though Tyreek Hill is still on this team. And as mentioned earlier, Tyreek Hill led all receivers in yards per route run, averaging nearly 3.4 yards per route run last year. And this is a pretty cool stat from Fantasy Points. This was a tweet I saw. This is a stat for first reads, where you're looking your quarterback right away to throw the ball first. Tyreek Hill last year, 37% of the time he was looked at by his quarterbacks, 4th most in the NFL. Jalen Waddle is far down this list. Tyreek clearly the number 1 on the team. So I'd rather just take guys around him who have a little bit more upside, like a Devonta Smith, like a Garrett Wilson and Amon-Ra for sure. Next man up is T. Higgins, who's an interesting option this year. He goes in like round 3 of fantasy drafts, and honestly, I'm passing on him a lot. He's just going around the elite quarterbacks, some solid running backs, and some of the wide receivers we've already talked about. And as we showed this tweet earlier, he's just a clear wide receiver 2 on his team. Just 21% of the first reads last year, according to Fantasy Points, compared to Jamar Chase, the obvious potential future Hall of Famer already in his career, seeing 37%. Now, don't get me wrong. Higgins is still a great player. He was 12th at earning fantasy points per target last year. The issue was he only saw 6.5 targets per game because he's competing with Jamar Chase, and the Bengals were running the ball more last year. They started to run more because teams were playing 2 high safeties on them. Zone defense. When you do that, you got to run the ball more to beat it. So the moral of the story is I'm typically passing on Higgins for an elite quarterback or one of the other receivers in this round. Now, the wide receiver 14 is Chris Olave. I'm pretty close to moving him ahead of Higgins as well. There's a lot to unpack here with Olave. It starts in college. When he was coming out, people were saying, oh, he's NFL ready, but probably as a number 2. But then he comes into the league as a rookie, puts up over 1,000 yards, and was top 10, number 10 overall in yards per route run, his wide receiver efficiency, which normally this means you're on track to continue to be an elite receiver in fantasy the following year. Now, Olave only finished as the wide receiver 25 last year as a rookie, but he left 2 games early, which is skewing his fantasy points per game, and he only scored 4 touchdowns, which if he scores even an average 6 or 7, he would have finished as probably a top 20 option. Now, in his 13 completed games, didn't leave early last year, Olave averaged 13.7 points, which was top 20 last year. The issue for this year is that Michael Thomas is now back. He looked good before his injury last year, and there's a new quarterback in town. In theory, Derek Carr, this new quarterback, should be an upgrade, but it's yet to be seen. And where Olave goes right now, he's fallen into round 3, the 26th overall player, which in round 3, I am a fan of him. In round 2, I pass on it. Now, before we get to the number 15 overall receiver, I want to let you know about this next asset. Now, thousands of you have already gotten this, but it is the fantasy blueprint, because if you want to win your league this year, smack around your buddies, the blueprint is for you. Plain and simple, it's going to have all the tools and analysis you need to do just this. Not not just our top 24 wide receiver rankings, but all the way through over 100 wide receivers ranked. You can see right here, we have our tiers, which we have another video on. You can see tier 1 for the running backs and all different positions. This is just a small sample of what you get. Now, it's simple to get the blueprint. You just click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen right now and follow the 2 simple steps. These are those 2 simple steps on the website. And for some reason, look at this. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll just refund the one-time payment of $5. So it's 100% risk-free. And yes, that's $5 for the entire year, not just your draft, but weeks 1 through 17. I'll send you tools as well. So if you want to get access to your blueprint today, joining the thousands of other people already using it, well, just click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen. Now we'll finish up tier 3 at the wide receiver position with Deebo Samuel, who had a bad year last year, was only just the 28th overall wide receiver, but there's a reason for this. Deebo dealt with a bunch of injuries. It started in October with a hamstring strain, which limited him for a couple of weeks. Then he had a high ankle sprain in December, which kept him out for some weeks. He also was banged up in camp to start last year and was in a contract dispute, so he held out, didn't get chemistry with his teammates. But in 7 healthy games with Brock Purdy last year, Deebo averaged 13.8 points on 7.4 targets per game and was a top 15 wide receiver. Now, tier 4 starts off with a veteran DeAndre Hopkins, who, look, Hopkins, despite being 30 years old now, he still had it last year. The fellow was number 2 at beating man coverage last year and earned nearly 10.7 targets per game. So it still shows he can get open. He was still producing for fantasy. And now his stock is up because he left Arizona. They were projected to score the fewest points in the league, some quarterback issues. And now he joins Tennessee, who has an efficient offense, is a well-coached team. And look at this. His only real target competition is Treylon Burks, who's already dealing with an LCL sprain, a pretty serious, I would say more than minor injury, what you're getting there. He might miss some weeks. So Hopkins is probably going to push towards like a 30% target share. So I was pretty neutral on Hopkins up until this Burks news. Now I want it. Now this brings us to Jerry Jeudy, the wide receiver 17 in tier 4. Now there was some recent news, and that news is not encouraging. Jerry Jeudy suffered a hamstring injury. At first, people thought, oh, he's getting carted off. Maybe he's out for the year, but it seems like it's a moderate hamstring injury. This could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 6+ weeks, depending on how moderate. But the good news is it's not severe, meaning he shouldn't be missing months, and he's actually still questionable or uncertain for week 1, so he has a chance to play there. So for right now, I'm leaving him here, but just be aware that you got to track this. We continue in tier 4 with our number 18 receiver, and it is Keenan Allen, who, look, I actually think he's a pretty risky pick when he goes in like round 3 or 4 this year, and look at this alarming trend. Allen ranked 99th at beating man coverage last year. This is now 3 years in a row that his efficiency has dropped, which we normally see for aging receivers like Allen, who's now 31. And here's even more key information. Allen has always relied on heavy volume, not touchdowns or downfield usage, to succeed. You can see this right here. Before last year, because of the injuries, he only got 89, but then it's 157, 147, 150, 137, 159. It's just always high volume, but now if he's struggling to beat man coverage, that volume might not come. And it's worth mentioning that the Chargers did go out there and draft a first-round receiver. Now for the number 19 wide receiver, we're still in tier 4 here. It is DK Metcalf, who this guy is a walking cheat code. And those cheat codes for wide receivers in fantasy are your deep targets, he was 12th in that category, and red zone targets, he was 2nd in that category. And according to fantasy points, not only that, he actually led every receiver in end zone targets. So, you know, when you're actually in the end zone, a chance to score a touchdown, he had 22, 4 more than any other receiver. And here's one more thing for you. He's now played in 22 games with Geno Smith as his quarterback, and he averages 15 fantasy points in these games, 7.8 targets. That's more than he did with Russell Wilson in his career. We finish up our top 20 receivers. Number 20 is Christian Watson, who this guy was only healthy for 7 games last year. And in these contests, he averaged over 18 fantasy points, which was top 10 production. And the craziest thing is Watson had this production despite Aaron Rodgers ranking 35th in accuracy. So as long as Jordan Love is just not the worst quarterback in the league, Watson should still do decent. Now, the one concern for Watson is maybe he has more target competition this year. I mean, maybe Romeo Doubs finally can get it going after a second good camp. Jaden Reed has looked great, the second-round rookie. And oh yeah, their tight end, Luke Musgrave, is second-round rookie. He's also looked fantastic. But Watson goes in like round 5 or 6. This is kind of baked in that I'll have some competition. And that will take us to our number 22 wide receiver, and it is Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And he's a polarizing option this offseason, but so far in the preseason and camp, he's looked good. Now, Ridley hasn't played football in over 20 months, and that's important to call out. And the last time he did play, he wasn't all that good, ranking just 72nd in yards per route run, but it's worth mentioning he was coming off of a foot injury heading into this year, a broken foot the year before, and, you know, this was only a small 5-game sample. And now his layoff was due from a combination of mental health and a sports gambling suspension. It's not like he has any physical ailments. And a reminder, in his last full season, well, he actually averaged 18.8 points per game and was the wide receiver 4 overall with Matt Ryan. Now he's on the Jaguars with Trevor Lawrence, who is probably a better quarterback and the best quarterback of his career. Now, Lawrence is known for spreading the ball around, but if Ridley is that elite receiver still, you can expect a 25+% target share. I actually like Ridley this year. I know some of my other videos have been against that. I just don't like him in the 3rd round of drafts where now he's getting pushed to. And that takes us to our final receiver in tier 4, our number 22 option. It's Deontay Johnson. I've been all in on this guy all off season because, yeah, I'll take the guy who was top 10 in usage last year, 9th in usage when he's going as like the 32nd receiver. And right now, all reports out of camp is that Kenny Pickett, the only first-round quarterback from last year, has looked really good. And this is encouraging because last year he wasn't great, yards per attempt just 32nd, but he was second in catchable passes. So he's throwing accurate passes probably because he wasn't throwing the ball much downfield. But if now Pickett's looking better and becomes more accurate between 10 and 20 yards, well, Deontay Johnson could have a lot more explosive plays. Because we know this dude is going to earn targets. Look at this over the last 3 years, 147, 169, and 144 targets. He had the record last year for most targets, 147 without a touchdown. Don't expect that again this year. Now we go to tier 5 and we see Christian Kirk here. And this is a little bit of a tougher one now after some preseason usage. But let's start with some positives. Kirk last year set career highs in everything. His targets 133, his receptions, and over 1,100 receiving yards. Now he's getting drafted later this year because of the guy we just talked about earlier. Calvin Ridley, his new teammate, is maybe going to be probably the wide receiver 1 on this squad. But that shouldn't be an issue because last year Zay Jones as the number 2 option on this team was a top 30 receiver. So now if Christian Kirk takes that role as a better player than Zay Jones, he should be fine as like a top 25 option. And that's where I have him ranked this year, but here is the concern. In the preseason, we only saw Christian Kirk used in the slot with the first team offense. It was actually Zay Jones staying on the field on the outside, not Christian Kirk with Ridley in 2 wide receiver sets. Now this is a small sample and they're going to pass a lot, so he'll still be on the field a lot as a slot receiver, but if this trend continues, he'll definitely see less snaps. But here's the thing, I'm just not convinced this trend actually continues because as Fantasy Points points out, the top wide receivers by passing rated when targeted on the outside, Christian Kirk was 4th in the NFL on the outside last year. So I think there's a good chance he actually takes that job back from Zay Jones. And oh yeah, he has the biggest contract, Christian Kirk, on this team, so he's incentivized to get on the field. Now our wide receiver 24 is Terry McLaurin. He goes in round 5 of fantasy drafts, the latest he's gone in the last 3 years, which is interesting because he's coming off of a year where he saw nearly 1,200 yards, a career high. And McLaurin over the last 3 years is averaging over 125 targets per season and a top 25 fantasy finish, but that's not all. Because McLaurin earned career high efficiency last year despite not seeing accurate targets. He ranked just 70th in catchable target rate. Only 72% of his targets were catchable, meaning 28%, nearly 1 out of every 3, was not catchable. So it can't get much worse than last year, and Sam Howell has actually looked really good this preseason. And the other thing to point out is look at this. Terry McLaurin has never scored more than 5 touchdowns in a season. Imagine he gets 1 year of touchdown luck and scores 8 or 9. Yeah, he's going to be like a top 12 option. Now, he did get banged up in the second preseason game, but he's expected to play sometime between week 1 and week 3, so there shouldn't be any major risks here in his profile. Now we get to our wide receiver 25. It's Amari Cooper, who, look, he's just the number 1 wide receiver in an efficient offense, and he even had success when Deshaun Watson was struggling this year. Imagine if Watson does a little bit better. Now we head to tier 6. Our wide receiver 26 is Mike Williams, who the big thing here is he's healthy, and now Justin Herbert is healthy, basically playing with a messed up rib and a punctured rib all of last year. Our wide receiver 27 is an exciting player. It's going to be Drake London. London, as a rookie last year, was number 11 in yards per route run. We showed Chris Olave earlier. He was 10th in this metric, and he's going so much earlier in drafts because, well, people think that the Falcons are going to be pretty run heavy. They probably will be, but London goes in a nice spot of draft for what his upside is. The number 28 wide receiver is DJ Moore, who the big concern here is that it's a mobile quarterback. They didn't throw a lot last year. Their leading receiver last year averaged like 5 targets a game in Darnell Mooney before his injury, and your quarterback is not all that accurate. Big concerns for DJ Moore. But not as many concerns with this next guy. He might actually move ahead of DJ Moore pretty soon. And that would be the veteran Chris Godwin in Tampa Bay. Look, yeah, I get it that Baker Mayfield is now his quarterback, but Baker Mayfield actually loves targeting the slot. That's where the most success goes for Baker Mayfield and his receivers, and that's where Chris Godwin, as one of the best and biggest size-wise slot wide receivers, plays. And now for our wide receiver 30. That will be Marquise Hollywood Brown, who, if Kyler Murray was healthy to start the year, would probably be a top 20 option. Because last year to start the season, when both Hollywood Brown and Kyler were healthy, he averaged 18.3 points on nearly 11 targets per game and was a top 5 option. And Marquise Brown averages over 15 points without DeAndre Hopkins, and we know that he's now gone. So these are the top 30 wide receivers for fantasy this year that you need to know before you draft. And if you want to see the top 30 running backs, well, check out this video right here. If you made it to the end, take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button. It'll help me, but it'll also help you see my future content so you can schmack around your buddies in fantasy football.